All right, welcome to the Michigan Works Association 2020 Annual Conference. My name is Jeff Cassidy, and I'm the Director of Policy with the Michigan Works Association. On behalf of the staff of the association and all of our sponsors, we thank you for being a part of the conference in this session titled Resilient Workforce Ecosystems Fostering Economic Recovery. A big shout out of thanks to EDSI for sponsoring today's workshop session. Our sponsors help make this conference happen, and we're very thankful for their support. Along with our sponsors, our exhibitors who have also given their time to be part of our event. Be sure to visit the exhibitor booths during the designated exhibit hall times. Before we begin today's session, there's a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. Please make sure your audio is muted. And if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the chat and I'll collect them all and we can address them at the end of the presentation. We are eager for your feedback about the conference and about this session. So please take a few moments to complete the short survey. I put the link to the survey in the chat area and I'll do it again at the end of the session. And presentations will be made available post-conference on the Michigan Works Association website. And now I would like to introduce your speaker for the session, Jasen Jones, Eastern U.S. Regional Manager with ACT. Jasen?
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and good afternoon, everyone. Sounding still okay good, Jeff, right?
You're good to go. Sounds good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And good afternoon. Thank you for your time today. And I hear the conference is going fantastic. So congratulations, Michigan, on pulling off such a big endeavor and being able to pivot to that virtually. It's definitely interesting times here. Well, again, welcome. Resilient workforce ecosystems are retooling in order to lead recovery efforts in their respective regions. Today's session at the Michigan Works Conference covers the roles and functions of the workforce ecosystem in disaster recovery and response. We'll highlight resources to help you plan and evaluate recovery efforts and hear from several contributors along the way with ideas and tips for reemployment strategies, solutions, promising practices, and even tools for upskilling and reskilling. Skills-based hiring works in the good times and the not so good times, and workforce ecosystems are often the go-to partners in disaster recovery, providing labor and training resources to address hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, basically any event that causes a mass dislocation of local jobs. And 2020 certainly gave us that, a unique disaster that requires a unique approach. To simplify this framework, we titled this five-part framework ALEDA, which is A-L-E-D-A, and that stands for adapt, lead, engage, deploy, and analyze. The first phase, adapt, helps us reimagine traditional disaster recovery models to meet the needs of a widespread biological disaster. Certainly in this case, we must adapt our data to be current and actionable in order to address each unique issue organically. Disaster recovery often requires that we unbundle our current services to create the flexibility needed and really convert those options for remote access and any other safety protocols that we have to have along the way. I skipped a slide there. Thank you. Certainly, these complex challenges really need stronger collaboration. And when you think about disaster recovery, the systems that you normally depend on, be they electronic or infrastructure, roads and bridges that might be destroyed in a hurricane or fires, for instance, we certainly want to have a customer-centered approach and doing everything we can to really be agile in our approach to design thinking as well. So what are we doing that's really going to help, with quick, agile collaborations, how we're focusing on measurable outcomes, and ultimately engage the network shareholders versus stakeholders. We had a chance to work with Ed Morrison, who may be familiar to many of you in the strategic doing framework in terms of getting strategic about doing. And we interviewed Ed Morrison for episode 4 of the Ready for Work podcast, which is linked in your slide deck as well. And I was actually looking over the attendees list. I was really thrilled to hear that Virginia Hamilton is with us here at the conference. I'm not for sure if she's here in this particular session or not, but I got to hear from Virginia a few years back on the WIOA implementation, and I attended a session out in Region 6 on design thinking, customer-centered design basically, and how we could deploy that to improve the one-stop system. I was able to do so in my previous role as a workforce board director in Southern Missouri. And I'll tell you, this customer-centered design process really has a superior role in not only implementing concepts that have a lot of moving parts, right? We're certainly that case in workforce development, but certainly in disaster recovery as well. When our community, Joplin, Missouri, recovered from an EF5 tornado in 2011, we actually used this design thinking process to basically redesign the high school. We had a high school built in the 50s, and here it was, going to open a new school in 2012. And we needed to decide, hey, it's a lot different now. And how would we build this high school since we have a clean slate? So there's certainly a lot of scenarios where human-centered design, customer-centered design makes a whole lot of sense. So I'd like to bring in our first clip here from Virginia Hamilton. Of course, this was when she was a regional administrator with the Region 6 DOL out of San Francisco. But Virginia gives us a quick overview of the customer-centered design process.
In this model, there are really 5 stages. The first is really understanding in a deep way the people that you're serving and getting inspired by those people in some new ways, which then identifies patterns and surprising new insights that will help you in the design process. The third stage is to brainstorm lots of new ways to serve your customers. And then finally, really critically and important, trying out your ideas, getting feedback from customers, testing things, as opposed to putting together a whole big giant plan, spending a year working on it, and then rolling it out and having it not work.
And Virginia really offers some really great advice. I mean, it can start with as simple as a phrase of how might we?
The question, how might we, is the most powerful question that I've really come across. How assumes that solutions exist. Not can we, should we, will we. We know that solutions exist. We just need to figure out how. Might reduces commitment. We're not saying how can we, how will we, how should we. We're saying how might we. There might be a million different ideas that we could use. Some of them are really crazy, but those crazy ideas then may actually have a kernel of something that we could really implement well. And we implies that we're doing this together. Customer-centered design really involves diverse teams of people working together to solve problems.
And there are the links there to the customer's centered design community of practice at Workforce GPS from USDOL, as well as a link to an organization called IDEO. They do a lot of corporate work, but they also do a lot of cause-related issues and certainly what helps out in nonprofits and very, very, as you heard Virginia say, viable to the workforce development practice as well. So certainly check out that IDEO link. IDEO.org is where you'll find the nonprofit version of those resources. Now, as we shift gears and also kind of speaking about workforce resources from Workforce GPS, there was recently published, I think it was really within the last 4 weeks or so, the Pathway to Recovery, a Quick Start Action Planner. And I really depended on these a lot when I worked as a local workforce board director for 14 years in Missouri. And certainly when you think about a community-based recovery process, how you're going to integrate all the aspects of disaster recovery and economic recovery, and it's in several different sections that make sense, right? Service delivery, using labor market info, how to, engage your partnerships and planning, and then certainly how you manage that infrastructure and the capacity for these types of services as well. Now, unique disasters, they really require, a unique approach, and data may look very different as well. So putting on the lens of the workforce ecosystem, your need to be, your information systems need to be built on primary data that you collect locally from employers, participants, and other channels along the way as well. Now, using primary data in your recovery framework provides 3 major advantages. And I'm going to bring in a colleague from ACT, Mary LaFay. She is a policy expert in workforce development and is a program director on our governmental relations team at ACT. Mary's going to show us how primary data helps us stay on course.
Local needs are unique. Not all communities are going to have the same strengths and weaknesses. So taking the time to connect with employers and other key stakeholders, it demonstrates care and goodwill, but it also creates stakeholder involvement in a community solution from the start of your initiative. Collecting local data is like creating a target. It helps stakeholders to improve the aim of strategies, but also create customized solutions aimed at specific issues and gaps.
Mary noted that recovery organizations also use primary data to track local needs and contacts of individuals and businesses for use in their follow-up relief efforts.
While you are in the process of building out this repository of local data, make sure that you are tracking contact information within a case management database. It will help to keep track of local employers and organizations in need, but as well as to identify and catalog specific resources to match and attract relief efforts. When you do this, you'll be able to highlight similar trends in types of resources needed across stakeholders.
And having the right data to make a compelling case for investment in disaster recovery, that's the third benefit of primary data collection through the lens of the workforce ecosystem. We'll hear from Mary one more time on this category.
At the end of the day, all of this work will improve your community's responsiveness to grant proposals by leveraging all of this local primary data to make the strongest case possible for funding. While state and national trend data might be easier to collect and track, strong locally collected data is easier to convert to action and to ensure that all needs and gaps are met.
Here we'll be summarizing some of the key questions and solutions for primary data collection. Mary encourages us to involve key stakeholders in designing some of the measures that you'll be looking for in your primary data collection as well.
So perhaps this is the most important key question to keep in mind. Have those who are responsible in terms of key stakeholders in the community who are actually responsible for the performance being measured been both identified and fully involved in the development of the measure? That can help bring a sense of realism to the type of data that you're trying to collect, the sustainability of it, the timeliness of it, the accuracy of it. And so make sure that you're involving those folks from the start of the process, as we talked about in the toolkit.
Now, there can be a lot of value to data sources that are from other associations or even agencies, trade associations, sector groups, certainly state and federal agencies as well. Now, Mary gives us tips on what to look for in analyzing data for its value and its ability to make comparisons.
Do the measures allow for meaningful trend or statistical analysis? Interviews and surveys are great, but they do have limitations in terms of being able to look at differences over time. So just keep things like that in mind when you're doing more qualitative data collection versus quantitative. And again, these don't have to be very complicated measures, so simplify as much as you can. Leverage local data gurus and researchers to help you figure out what types of statistical data would be easiest to collect.
Thank you, Mary. And we'll shift gears just a little bit to look on the economic development side of things. I imagine that we have a lot of workforce developers that are heavily integrated in the economic development process throughout Michigan. And we're pleased now to hear from Eric Canada with Blaine Canada Limited, a key influencer in the economic development practice of business retention and expansion. Eric shares with us his perspective on the importance of primary data in the recovery process.
What we've seen not only in COVID-19, but in previous cases is all of a sudden you jump into the fray of helping. As a result, you've got no basis for who you're helping or why, again, you should have priorities within how you allocate your help resources. If you're using national data or state data, it gives you a general feel, perhaps. If you don't first know your local companies, then you're not going to have the ability to prioritize appropriately.
And disaster recovery requires a skilled workforce to provide restoration and humanitarian relief. Positions can range from direct services to those in need or indirect services that help the recovery program as a whole. Now, here's where a lot of communities run into difficulty, and that's deploying disaster workers quickly if you really don't have a basic standard for skills and that, to provide that really quick turnaround in training and placement at the same time. Those same challenges are what employers face in the alignment alignment of skill levels to jobs that they need to perform and can hold back disaster recovery programming as well. Chris Mannheim of Mannheim Solutions is an ACT WorkKeys job profiler, and he explains why this alignment is essential.
Once they get that skills assessment, once they even identify that the people doing the job, then the light bulb starts to go off. Particularly HR departments that are trying to cross-train a variety of folks. More often than not, I find that they don't understand what they're actually doing in those jobs. With the curriculum profiling, what I've found is that they have a curriculum, sort of, but it's not been formalized. So you have people who have been in the field and they've never really sat down to work out a real syllabus. And they're not quite sure what the applicant should have. One thing every organization has to do, and you have to do it almost constantly, you want to know what is your base. Identify the workforce, identify your infrastructure, et cetera, and then you begin from there.
Now, what's helpful when you think about skill levels that Chris was referring to, we actually have on the screen all of the counts of National Career Readiness certificates that were earned through the end of August of 2020. And you can see there the distribution. Generally, you see in many states about half of the certificates being at the silver level, and then really the other half or quarter kind of split between bronze and gold, and a few platinums there at the same time. That's really helpful as you think about how you pinpoint these skill levels and align those to disaster recovery jobs. So what you also see on the screen comes directly from our job profile database. We make this available free of charge, and it's right online. And so it's linked to ONET, very heavily integrated with ONET. So we have ONET codes, the closest ones that can be aligned to a lot of these types of disaster recovery positions that, might be very common in a type of effort. Mary LaFay also shows us how to apply those skill alignment tools in disaster recovery.
Disaster recovery is going to require a skilled workforce to both provide restoration and humanitarian relief. Recovery positions can range from direct support services for individuals all the way to indirect services to help in the overall program recovery. By integrating products like ACT WorkCase into the flow of workforce services for disaster recovery, communities can help to pinpoint the foundational skills needed for an individual to successfully learn and to perform job-related tasks.
Thank you, Mary. We're going to shift gears now from the adapt component of the framework into lead. And our first task there will be communicate. The work-ready communities of Northeast Tennessee have some great examples of integrated leadership of the workforce system. There are similarities in the way this partnership battles the opioid crisis affecting many parts of the country. Northeast Tennessee is actually a shining example of how to make a difference, how to really move things forward in terms of doing so from a workforce development initiative. And these are, of course, lessons learned that are going to be very useful in this continuing economic crisis and the recovery that lies ahead. Their leadership navigated this battle with strong data, intentional communications, and a very sharp focus on trauma-informed care. By the way, you can hear the full presentation from Lottie in episode 13 of the Ready for Work podcast. In this clip, Lottie shares with us the important role of communications in healing an entire community in dealing with the opioid crisis in Northeast Tennessee.
One is to humanize the issue of the opioid crisis, because that's kind of how we started in this. You can't get to a solution and problem solving if you don't recognize the problem for what it is. And we're in a part of the country where it would be get over it, pull up, buy your own bootstraps and take care of this issue and move on. So we really had to bring it into visibility so that people, again, could see the human side of this for us to begin to start trying to solve the problem, or at least make a dent in some of the issues. The issue has an impact on our schools, on our workforce, on our community. And as trite and it might sound, it really does take a village to be the solution. We became very intentional to get the message out, whether it be going on the road and doing a bunch of presentations at Kiwanis clubs and Rotary clubs, or getting the media involved. Because we believe we needed the story to be told in a positive way, but the story had to be told because it would take the conversation happening around the region for people to get behind change. So we viewed the media as our partner. Then it became almost an avalanche. There was a part of me that was like, okay, I don't want every single day, every above the fold to be about the issue, but it was for a while. But I believe that's why we started seeing change in our region, because people were brave enough to talk about it and then say, what can we do about it?
Thank you so much, Lottie. And of course, a resource there from restoreyoureconomy.org comes from the partnership with the International Economic Development Council and the Economic Development Administration. Will be much like Workforce GPS, referring to a lot of different resources from restoreyoureconomy.org along the way as well. Now, Workforce Ecosystem is a public-private partnership, and every partner has a role, especially in disaster recovery. It is really that local role that's going to make the difference and change lives, because you're working directly with disaster victims and those individuals that are assisting in the recovery efforts as well. The state and federal roles are very important as they define the overall policy and support those policies through funding to local agencies and providers. But it's actually those providers, again, the local folks, much like we see in Workforce System and the one-stop locations, that actually execute those strategies and deliver those services to those in need as well. What we've linked there is, again, I had ran the Workforce Board in Joplin, Missouri as part of our 2011 tornado recovery process. And the logo there is what we call the CART team, the Citizens Advisory Recovery Team. And as you can imagine, this is a group of citizens and local leaders here in Joplin that helped shape the recovery. They had, I believe, 9 strategies, key strategies overall, and 2 of those were very specifically workforce development strategies. So you can read more about that effort and the sample of the recovery plan in there as well. And we talk a little more about the workforce ecosystem. Again, these are some of those example roles of different players of the workforce ecosystem and how they're actually helping in this overall recovery effort. And certainly those leaders that you'll want to be convening along the way as well. Now, here we have some of the roles, and this is actually another resource out of restoreyoureconomy.org. I think this is very helpful because, in essence, workforce development folks wear a lot of hats, right? I imagine this is the case in Michigan, as it is in a lot of parts of the country. Well, these are what some of those hats or roles are going to be when you're a leader in this disaster recovery process, part of this conveying process, what your role in that leadership is going to be. So you can kind of look at each of the 6 of those and get some more information at that IEDC and EDA link for restoreyoureconomy.org that is on the slide as well. Now, I want to talk just very briefly about work-ready communities, because this is an effort. Jasper County, which makes up a good chunk of Joplin, Missouri, was the first ACT work-ready community. And again, I didn't come to ACT until 2017. This happened in 2013. And one of those 9 recovery strategies that we spoke of with the CART team was around work-ready communities. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide other than to say that that is an ideal framework in terms of integrating the elements that you see there across the workforce ecosystem, and can be very helpful in terms of economic recovery, disaster recovery, trying to reduce poverty, a number of different strategies that local areas, regions that look to in terms of becoming a work-ready community. I also wanted to put that up there because Michigan right now has 13 counties that are participating in the Work-Ready Communities Initiative. 2 of those are fully certified, and this work-ready focused region has 271 employer endorsements of the National Career Readiness Certificate. Now, that joins over 26,000 employers nationwide that look to this certificate and prefer that in their hiring process as well. Now we're going to be moving on into some of the, in the engage phase, in essence, of the ALEDA framework, the 3rd phase, obviously very essential to how you're going to be reaching participants, those immediate referrals and intake, and how you're going to follow up in the major projects your recovery effort will eventually launch. And keep in mind, too, that, you know, we're certainly dealing with more pandemic-related economic recovery efforts here in 2020, but local areas are going to find themselves, you know, affected by some disaster. If they're man-made, natural disasters, I think the Flint water crisis certainly qualifies as a disaster that, you know, required a lot of recovery effort as well. But along with outreach to students and adults, you're going to really need a playbook on how to develop work sites and encourage employers for the long haul. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But the engage phase also needs to define how you're going to be removing barriers for participants that would really prevent their success. Barriers that you normally see in the workforce process: transportation, childcare, other personal needs. And the way that you engage these participants depends largely on the local disaster scenario, obviously, and how you've adapted to meet those windows of really connecting with participants. Now, in the Alita model in Joplin, we did this recovery program in 3 phases. And certainly the pre-launch phase that we talk about can start as soon as it's safe to do so and doesn't interfere with any rescue functions. And really the best place to start is getting information out and handling those referrals on demand. If it's feasible, capture some basic contact information along the way, because you'll find out as a workforce development entity, and then when these grants kick in, you're going to need that later for follow-up. Also kind of give some thought to what services you do provide, how they can start out online, or at least locations where it is safely integrated with the safety protocols that we have now. Now, ideally, employer engagement is happening as quickly as possible with the business and retention partnership. There are a number of worksite development functions that can happen behind the scenes as well. Now, keep in mind the funding in your partnership. It may be dislocated worker grants, what a lot of us knew in the field as national emergency grants from DOL ETA. The funding in your partnership, the potential funding for those disaster grants may be prioritizing what humanitarian or recovery worksites will need to launch first. And then, of course, capture those first rounds of participant candidates in this work-based learning activity. Now, good examples of those work sites are going to be ones that fill gaps in public and social services that are needed for their recovery. Turnkey projects, super ideal, because believe me, your political leadership at the state and local level are going to want those things to open as quickly as possible, right? But any of those turnkey projects with other public, community, or other nonprofit organizations will really be helpful. If you're in a rural area, you should be looking for gaps in services from libraries, schools, community centers, and local governments. The work sites, as far as work-based learning, these could be short-term employment, internships, apprenticeships, whatever you can think of in that category. Thinking long-term, of course, these placements are hopefully resulting in permanent employment, and you're working with employers, rebounding and rehiring these individuals ideally. So having employer needs identified and integrated into this temporary work-based learning process will improve the odds of those workers returning successfully. We do have another link for Dennis Williams. He's the workforce director in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and the surrounding region of the Western Arkansas Planning and Development District. We have him linked up in podcast episode number 21, where you can get Dennis's advice. It has, again, a lot of background on preparing and launching those grants in Arkansas. We're going to talk about intake next, and certainly once those public systems are stable enough to permit in-person engagement, there are some limited functions, of course, that the provider could group together to reduce the risk of infection and injury, ultimately, reducing the number of times that a customer would have to come into the one-stop, and while they are there in an open facility, how to basically kill 2 birds with 1 stone, make that efficient as possible. So this follow-up intake phase could finish those intakes and enrollments, deliver any needed assessments, connect with certainly case managers and job counselors to remove barriers, and then deliver those basic worksite orientations. And again, all that can happen in a single facility if it's safe to do so. But be thinking about, the barriers your participants face in getting to your facility, and then how to make the most of their visit while they're there. That way they don't have to make quite as few visits along the way as well. Now, the assessments, training, certification, all these services, activities that you're implementing, that's pointing toward the 3rd phase of engagement, which is the program launch. Now, this launch phase, of course, will trigger when a participant is placed in a recovery project worksite, maybe an apprenticeship or other work-based learning or training and certification activities that can help accelerate a career pathway. Keep in mind that your program needs to address and balance the risks and the burdens to participants along these 3 engagement phases. When you consider the value and role of work keys and other assessments that your location would normally offer, think about again where you place those assessments, and the workflow or this customer service flow could actually depend on the goal of the assessment. If you're using it to place into a work-based learning program versus going directly into employer placement, that could obviously affect the timing of when you would choose to do your assessments, any of your value-added assessments. For employers, of course, that have an immediate need for a candidate, you can actually prioritize that assessment up front in the process in that example. And some locations can offer work keys and other services on an appointment-only basis that would, again, integrate that social distancing protocol. I want to bring in Mike Longo now. He's the director of a Lorain County location for Ohio Means Jobs, which includes the Workforce Board in Lorain County, Ohio. And he gives us a peek in how they rally partners for their Make Your Layoff Payoff initiative.
The other thing that came with the Make Your Layoff Payoff initiative was that we created access points that were established both at community college and at the Career Technical Education Center, where staff from those partners were cross-trained basically on how to help assist with determining eligibility, completion of the required paperwork, collection of source documentation to support eligibility, and basically it allowed students to access our services right on those campuses versus actually having to come to the American Job Center. It was definitely a great partnership in trying to help the folks during that time.
We'll be hearing more from Mike later on in terms of the deploy phase of this framework as well. Now, moving into that direction, of course, we're going to start with the remote options. And while we've covered the phases of analyze, lead, and engage, we're at the deploy phase now of this ALETA framework. Now, ACT suite of workforce solutions do have considerable flexibility in the sequence and the flow of these services that you have in local workforce centers and schools that do testing throughout Michigan. And this makes adjusting the flow considerably easier for responding to mass layoffs and disasters. So keep in mind, the Work Keys tests right now have that requirement for live in-person proctoring, and that's essential to protect the integrity of the assessment and the validity of the results as well. But again, it helps to think of disaster response as an unbundling of what you normally provide in order to tweak the balance of physical or connected resources. And we do provide a link that you see there, social distancing guidelines that integrate all those CDC recommendations into how you would deploy that in a normal proctoring scenario as well. Now, Sean McCoy notes that students with low digital literacy, they may need a different approach when using remote technology. Sean McCoy, by the way, is with Public Consulting Group, and we've got an interview scheduled with him that's obviously been recorded and scheduled to be released in our Ready for Work podcast as well. But let's start with with what Sean's recommendations are in terms of how you work with individuals on a remote basis that may have low digital literacy.
As they're in a class and you're trying to educate them online, you can take control of their computer. Basically, it's almost like a team viewer. You can show them on the screen what they're looking for, so that one-to-one teacher over your shoulder type of education can still be done online and virtually. So they still have the access to be able to show you what you're missing, be able to type on your screen, direct you to where you're going, move the mouse to the key points to allow you to have access to what they're learning and to enhance your knowledge, skills, and abilities to complete the course competencies.
And Sean also has some advice for us in terms of thinking of equity and along, the way of everything that's involved in disaster recovery and these processes.
If everybody's calling one state agency, everybody's calling the local workforce board, if everybody's calling the city, we've all heard the thing, you're now 25th in line, your estimated wait time is 45 minutes. Vera and other virtual platforms give the opportunity for individuals to seek out knowledge on their own, avoid some of those delays in getting compensation, access to services that they desperately need at a time like this. All natural disasters, rural regions, budget shrinkage that you can't have 7 brick and mortar sites and you have to go down to 5. Forcing someone to drive 250 miles to access your center may not be in their best interest or your best interest. So offering virtual services helps create equitable accessibility.
Work-based learning, of course, remains a very important solution in the public workforce system, and the Missouri Chamber of Commerce upgraded their Intern Connect and Apprentice Connect programs for virtual service delivery. It's a great project. They did that actually in conjunction with the state workforce and education agencies, but particularly through the small business development centers in terms of connecting apprentices and interns along the way as well. Kelly Dyer from the SBDC, partner of the Missouri Chamber, is going to give us an overview of those virtual apprenticeships.
The workforce has gone to remote for a lot of positions. I've read as high as 40% of our workforce won't go back even after the pandemic. So the virtual internship is the same thing, is allowing the students to work from home to make a contribution to the company by giving them a project to work on, the same as if they were in person. It's the same experiential learning, it's just that they're doing it from a different location.
Thank you, Kelly. Workforce agencies might even include online training and the earning of a micro-credential in this process. And the WorkKeys curriculum can be a good fit during this phase because it can be deployed remotely, used with individuals or in cohorts. ACT also made practice tests for WorkKeys available online at no charge during this disaster phase as well. Keep in mind, in your local area, the goal here is to push out what you can for individuals to make use of their time and energy that they may have in order to prepare to hit the ground more quickly later on. What you can deliver remote before you have individuals visit any of your education or workforce partner sites, your locations of the American Job Centers and so forth. We also have some advice there in the form of a podcast in episode 20 with Bronwyn Robertson, and she talks about the use of the WorkKeys curriculum with adult ed students and the Mississippi Smart Start program. You can check that out in episode 20 of the podcast as well. Another piece of work-based learning, and certainly when you're deploying some of your longer-term solutions in the career pathway, a lot of grants that are made available from the U.S. Department of Labor, the dislocated or national emergency grants that we spoke of earlier, they'll be putting a priority on some of this work-based learning, especially when you can have labor that's going to be in either, disaster relief or humanitarian work sites. The Missouri Disaster Recovery Jobs Program, the link that you see there actually will give you a link to the full PDF manual of how we deployed this type of disaster recovery throughout the state of Missouri, again, with a big chunk of that happening in Southwest Missouri. We basically had three primary objectives at the Workforce Board at that time in Joplin. And that was certainly providing that labor for what we needed. Victims needed humanitarian support, and victims needed, more infrastructure support through debris removal that would be part of that restoration process. And again, that could even be indirect support along the way as well. One of our first work sites and ultimately was cited as a best practice by the Federal Emergency Management Agency is that we deployed through a new startup organization, nonprofit in Joplin called Rebuild Joplin after the tornado. We actually used some of our participants, placed them with that organization, and basically had a back office of anywhere between 6 and 12 individuals along the program that basically there were so many data entry functions that had to happen, not only with our program, but with tracking the donations and how they were dispersed as far as goods through FEMA. And that's why they picked up on this as a best practice. And again, those are participants that were right out of our NEG with our dislocated worker grant that were filling that function. The second objective really was for jobs for the displaced workers. And if you think about 2011, Joplin was just about over the original recession we had, kind of thinking 2009, 2010 and so forth, as when we had this tornado hit. So we still had a number of displaced workers in our labor market. And in many cases, it may vary by grant to grant, but there will be eligibility for those on long-term unemployment to be able to participate in a disaster recovery work site as well. So that's, again, helpful for those victims that were displaced from their jobs as well as homes and other things during the tornado, but also long-term unemployed, getting those individuals to work. And we really needed them. We ultimately had, I think, about 900 workers over the course of that year-and-a-half grant. So just the storm victims alone, we definitely needed that pool of unemployed, displaced workers, previous long-term unemployed individuals, I need to be specific, that would help us with that labor supply. And then finally, the third reason, back then, again, this was 2011, not terribly, just maybe 5 or 6 years after Hurricane Katrina, and the examples of kind of what happened in the New Orleans area in that region, we really wanted to not lose our workforce. It was very essential. Joplin did the best they could in terms of trying to retain residents. And it was pretty interesting that the school district, from when the tornado happened in May of 2011 to the period of school starting in August of 2012, we actually did not lose any students, and that was amazing in terms of the overall enrollment for the school district. But again, we wanted to avoid what became known as the Katrina effect, and losing residents and losing your workforce. So ultimately, those employers would rebuild; they would be ready to open, and we did not want to be in a labor shortage as a result of losing our population. So again, some very essential functions that you can consider along the way in these processes. Same thing for career pathways. And we're talking about, obviously, the work-based learning component of that career pathway, that they're building credentials along the way, taking short-term training where they can, and ultimately being placed with an employer and a pathway long-term, right? So these long-range goals of building skills and job growth, how we, can instill this culture of lifelong learning. And we have a number of different resources in credentialing from ACT, and again, workforce GPS reference along the community of practice for career pathways. And I'd also recommend checking out some of the credential resources from the Lumina Foundation when you're planning this recovery work along the way as well. And we talk a little more about training strategies, certainly how you're involving your workforce ecosystem in those post-disaster training options, how you can include, of course, in your recovery plan, what types of linkages are you going to be building for employer needs, and how you're going to know as employers are reopening, what types of positions they have. Are they changing anything as a result of, again, the chance to rebuild their business from scratch with the insurance proceeds and such. And as we talked about earlier, that's why it's so essential to have those primary data collection points in place, your retention and expansion efforts in place with economic development teams to really make sure they have a good handle on the pulse of what those employers are going to be needing on their reopening. Work-based learning strategies, wage supports, anything that you can do along the way that can assist that completion, help individuals persist to complete their training programs, will be very essential in the process as well. Now we're at our last phase of the 5-part framework, and that's analyze. And we're going to be bringing back Mike Longo here to kind of talk about some of the efforts underway, but I'll point out the resources. Of course, you see the link to a case study there for Lorain County and the Ohio Means Jobs Center in the Lorain County region. There's also a research study on the other side of Ohio, the Southwest region, where we partnered with the Workforce Board in Southwest Ohio and the Manufacturing Skills Standards Council to develop a career pathway that ultimately can be built upon the cognitive skills of the National Career Readiness Certificate, and then make that very relatable to future credentials from MSSC, the Certified Production Technician, Logistics Technician, the new forklift certification that MSSC has along the way too. So let's hear from Mike just a bit as we continue on learning about how Mike looked at grabbing partners together and pulling this process through, and then how they ultimately were meeting outcomes in the way of this process as well.
And in Lorain County at that time, there was a partnership created between our local community college and our joint vocational school, Career Technical Education Center. It was named Make Your Layoff Pay Off, and it was basically a very strong push towards having people who were impacted consider short-term certificate programs or associate degree programs to use the time of their layoff to try to better prepare for when things were going to improve.
And there are a number of different recessions in the past that did just that, what Mike was talking about, where employers had that opportunity to retool. So how do we know on the other side, if their candidates before a disaster, before a closure, would be ready to return to that job at a higher level of a skill expectation with those employers along the way as well? Let's hear from Mike one more time.
Career technical education providers have the baseline scores that they're expecting. If somebody wants to get into, let's say, welding training, the CTE Center has the baseline scores that are required, and it kind of plays in the same way. So if somebody's coming to our center for occupational skill training funds and they don't assess at that level, these tools are there. And if they're working at trying to enhance their skills, you're seeing them logging into the curriculum account or you're seeing them show up into the classroom, that all plays into our decision of determining their appropriateness for the training funds. And we've seen that with those that do increase their scores to what was required to get into the programs, they tend to be successful with completing the program and obtaining the certification. So ultimately, they're helping our performance through the WIOA standards that we have in place.
ACT adapted the resources of our career readiness benchmarks from WorkKeys into a special risk analysis of occupations that local leaders and employers will find helpful in their desire to bring workers back on the job safely. By comparing these high contact or no or low contact jobs, planners can identify which jobs are the most practical or most impacted along the way in this process. So again, check that out when you're thinking about reopening schools, colleges, workforce centers, training programs and the like. And then the employers that your business services representatives work with may find this resource as well as they think about contact risk of individuals and then where individuals might be as far as their cognitive abilities and what types of planning may need to go into that training to help individuals be able to grasp those new requirements along the way as well. And we also have a number of different tracking systems with our Workforce Solutions Toolkit, a lot of research case studies on different outcomes that affect job seekers, employers, educators, communities. We're tracking a number of these different benefits through various case studies across the states and would recommend that you check out those resources along the way as well. And then finally, when you're analyzing your program, was it effective? And again, keep in mind that you may have, hopefully, traditional performance metrics in place that you can be able to match the data to when it comes the time to do that. But sometimes, based on a disaster scenario, you may need to look at alternative metrics along the way as well. So we have our last clip from Mary LaFay here on the use of alternative metrics and what to look for.
There's this great resource as part of the Restore Your Economy project, and it provides some guidelines to help evaluation in terms of determining quality and applicability of different measures. And some of these key questions include things like, can the measure that you're including in your program be evaluated objectively, timely, and in a cost-effective fashion? This is really important when every dollar that is part of a grant program really needs to be leveraged towards service delivery. So while expensive data collection methods are great for a one-off, they're not sustainable. And so you really should be encouraged to leverage existing researchers or any data gurus in your community, or even in your state labor market information office if you can.
As we come to the end of our presentation, I want to leave some links and resources with you. Again, since we have Michigan as one of our leading states in the number or the volume of national career readiness certificates, we hope you'll find these particular resources to be helpful as well. I've referred a number of different times to the Ready for Work podcast from ACT. And what we went over today, the Resiliency Toolkit, is actually one of two new toolkits that we produced from the Workforce Solutions group at ACT. The other one is around grant proposal development and resource development with skills-based hiring initiatives. The link that you're going to get in the PDF of this presentation will have a form that you can fill out to request that online, and we'll get that other toolkit shipped out to you as quick as we can. We also publish a workforce newsletter on a monthly basis at ACT, also available at no charge. And again, this will help Michigan's workforce and education systems make the most of, again, really great track record in earning the WorkKeys National Career Readiness Certificate. The Career Benchmark Report in the way of benchmarks for career pathways, we have that was released in January of 2020. And then finally, more details on Workforce Solutions. And the last link is our Workforce Summit. Now, as you can imagine, we also postponed our live event, in-person event that we were going to have in Michigan at the end of, in Memphis, Tennessee at the end of October. So we now have a series of roadshow events planned. We have our first one coming up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in December. We would like to actually bring this to Michigan as well, and are targeting maybe the late winter of 2021, early spring perhaps, of actually having one of our Workforce Summit Roadshow events, just a one-day conference with some breakouts and again, a lot of good resources, networking, tip sharing, and so forth. So you can click on that workforce link and kind of, again, if you fill out to subscribe to the newsletter, you'll be informed of those other opportunities along the way as well. And if you have not had a chance to download the presentation yet, I'm actually going to put the other version of that welcome slide on there so you can grab the link there. It's basically the Cutley short link, and you can get a PDF with all of these links that will be active in your presentation. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you about certainly the challenges that we have ahead. And it's great to bring back Jeffrey Cassidy now, who's been kind of watching the chat systems and has maybe some potential questions and answers. Any feedback, Jeff, on the session so far today?
We haven't had a lot of activity in the chat box. We did get one chat that said good information. So, and you have provided a lot of information. So thanks very much, Jason, for your time today. We really appreciate it. Do you have any final comments or any wrap-up comments that you'd like to add?
Yeah, again, just thank you so much for the opportunity. We really want to get these toolkits in the hands of as many workforce leaders and ecosystem leaders, their partners in career education, economic development, and so forth. The more the merrier as far as taking these resources and being able to really deploy a skills-based hiring process. Ultimately, I think that's the whole theme of this presentation, is that there is a very important role for workforce development in disaster and economic development recovery, and using that skills-based process is going to expedite the way that individuals get reemployed, how they're picking up their skills along the way to get reemployed, and hopefully generate good results for the workforce system as well as their local regions. So again, on behalf of ACT, Jeff, thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with your conference today.
Well, thank you. Like I said, that was a really great comment you made at the end about recovery, disaster recovery. I think that's where we're hopefully headed right now. So thanks very much for that. This ends our presentation today. I'd like to thank Jason for his time. We appreciate your time in joining us. I hope you have some great takeaways and then we'll enjoy all the features of the conference. Thank you attending for the Michigan Works Annual Conference, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, folks. Have a fantastic day.